That's one explanation. And that's the one you'll find in some form or another in almost all the accounts that are written over the centuries. So I think that explanation is completely wrong. And it's blatantly Hispanocentric. There's another explanation which I think is better evidence and makes more sense. And that is that Montezuma is the opposite of being a superstitious coward. That he is very much in control of the situation. He sees and has been tracking these invaders since before they even arrived in Mexico, when they were sailing down the coast of Maya country. He's very curious about them. He wants to draw them into his city in order to control them, study them, learn from them. They are not a threat. There's just a few hundred of them. He has tens and tens of thousands of soldiers that he can use to destroy them if he needed to. He doesn't want to do that. He puts them up in his father's palace, right in the center, right next to his palace, and studies them, and they are there for 6 months as his guests. He goes hunting with them, they play games together, they learn each other's languages. And so the story that Montezuma actually surrendered and that they were kind of controlling the empire through him, as ludicrous as it is easily believed, because most of the Spaniards who were there at the end of the war, 1,000 who were there in August of 1521, the vast majority of them weren't in that situation. They'd come later, or they had been outside the city during that moment. But it presents us with a kind of a wonderful conundrum, I think, with a solution that really kind of blows our minds in terms of thinking what's really going on during this time period.
It has been seen that the Spaniards were thought of as white gods. Well, this is something which generally Spanish writers were casting back onto the events. We see none of that from the native sources themselves. To mention it, certainly in the context of Mexico, is completely incorrect.
The Cortés mythology has presented the idea that Cortés was always in control, that he was a master manipulator. It seems, however, that that's far from the truth.
When Cortés landed in Mexico, the Aztec Empire was in turmoil. Under Moctezuma, he had become much more oppressive. He demanded greater tribute from the Spanish. He had conducted a great purge against his political enemies. There had been a 3-year famine that led to widespread suffering.
Tlaxcalans were skillful enough to involve Cortés into their own rivalry against the Aztecs. This proved to be a crucial moment in the expedition because the Tlaxcaltecas are going to be the main allies that Cortés is going to have. So we need to remember that conquistadors, their success or failure depends sometimes on whether they're allowed to insert themselves in those much longer story that was happening between indigenous polities.
By embellishing the heroic exploits of the Spaniards in Mexico, it's easy to disguise the devastating impact of smaller, insidious European parasites brought upon the indigenous populations in Mesoamerica. Just as the Caribbean islands had been devastated by European pathogens decades earlier, now the mainland was to be struck with the same deadly force.
The Spaniards had horses, they had armor, and they had steel. And they had something else that they did not know they had, which was going to supersede all of this advantage, and that was disease.
Disease, probably smallpox, hits Mexico in April 1520, the core of the Aztec Empire, right in the middle of the military conquest.
It's estimated that 90% of the population died from smallpox, influenza, measles. Disease just destroyed them.
The Aztecs had been defeated. Their vast territories now just another distant corner of King Charles's Spanish kingdom. Europe could no longer ignore this growing empire or the rumors of its fearless conquistadors. These stories concerned Charles. 4,000 miles away, the self-proclaimed heroes seemed to be doing entirely as they pleased, drunk with power, basking in the untold riches of the New World. What could the crown do if this army of skilled killers
in control. And I think this was crucial.
Cortez, after his conquest, gained a great deal of favor by tremendous wealth. He was given titles by the Spanish monarch, lands, recognition. But Cortez, was being an ambitious man and never happy with what he'd accomplished. There was always more for him.
He's the most powerful man in the Americas, a lord of men. He has 100,000 native Mexicans working on his private estates. He's got everything he could ever want. But in 1524, he leaves it all behind to push on further south into Guatemala, into central Mexico, in what become a series of disastrous expeditions.
And so this began to erode his standing within Spanish society, although the monarch continued to support him for what he had done. And so ultimately, he did wind up with some lands and some wealth and some status, nothing like he achieved during the conquest. But he is still revered as probably the greatest conquistador.
Hernan Cortez would eventually return to Spain. On December 2nd, 1547, he would succumb to dysentery, choking to death on his own inflamed lungs. Cortez was dead, but his conquest of Mexico had opened the New World up to a tidal wave of European activity.
The conquest of Mexico changes everything, because now the Spaniards have seen that Native Americans can build vast cities, populations of tens of thousands, that they do practice intensive agriculture, very productive agriculture that sustains populations in millions, that they have accumulated vast amounts of precious metals and other forms of wealth and valuable goods. And so the conquest of Mexico leads to an explosion of Spanish exploration and conquest and settlement throughout the Americas.
Mexico City would eventually rise from the ashes of Tenochtitlan. And whilst the Aztecs may have been defeated, the largest civilization in the Americas had not yet felt the relentless force of the conquistadors. One impoverished Spaniard, Francisco Pizarro, found himself bored by the wild tales of another golden city, and grew desperate to discover the impossible riches which lay in wait to the south. He trekked to Peru, where he was soon to discover the land deadly setbacks were a necessary evil of empire building. The firm grip of the conquistadors already keenly felt across Central America. By the early 1520s, the port settlement of Panama City was a crucial transit point for the gold and silver being shipped back to the Old World. It also provided a stable base from which to launch new expeditions.
Establishment of a colony in Panama and the exploration of the Pacific is going to be the way that Spaniards are going to actually get in contact with indigenous societies in South America, in the Andean region, that is going to pique their interest to further explore southwards.
From the humid slums of Panama City, one man was listening carefully for whispers of these exotic golden cities to the south. Francisco Pizarro. He was born only a few miles from Hernan Cortés, amidst the squalor of poverty in a desolate Extremadura.
Francisco Pizarro is in many ways kind of like the opposite of Hernan Cortés. While Cortés was at least kind of low nobility, Francisco Pizarro came from very humble origins.
He arrived in 1502 in the Ovando expedition in the same fleet that brought Bartolome de las Casas to Hispaniola.
He had staged Indian wars in the Caribbean, on the north coast of South America, and ultimately in Panama in Central America too, where he comes to hold a municipal position in the town council of Panama. So he's very, very experienced.
But Pizarro was engaged in the horribly violent and destructive conquest of indigenous peoples in this area, slaughtering some, enslaving the rest, and through torture forced them to tell them where they had their gold treasures hidden. Would then go to the graves of the ancestors of these people, dig them up, take the gold. Pizarro was himself investigated for being a particularly brutal contributor to this violence.
It's in Panama that the Spanish hear the first faint rumors of a second great empire to the south, associated originally with the name Peru, but then becomes the name Peru. Pizarro, with two key companions, Diego de Almagro and Hernando de Luque, are the first two who think we should look into this. This is worth pursuing.
Having spent his 20s battling for the Americans as a lone-ranking conquistador, Pizarro was finally ready to rise to glory and make his name one which would never be forgotten. Exploration and expansion was surpassed by a feverish gold rush, and Pizarro needed to be in on the action. With Mexico already claimed by Cortés, he would push south, deeper into the unknown than any other European before him, to carve out his own realm. Meanwhile, other conquistadors based across Central America were competing to be first to claim the riches promised in unexplored regions beyond the Yucatan Peninsula. In Mexico City, the brutal Pedro de Alvarado, a rival of Pizarro, made his next expedition. His sights set on Guatemala and its fragmented population of Mayans.
The conquest of Guatemala is fascinating to me, in part because the Spanish protagonist of it is Pedro Alvarado, who was a captain of Cortés's expedition, and then kind of like went on his own to Guatemala. So we have a veteran of a previous expedition becoming the leader of a new expedition. You have also the fact that in the conquest of Guatemala, Pedro Alvarado departed from Mexico City, or from the Central Valley of Mexico, and that he brought with himself a great number of indigenous allies, especially people from Tlaxcala and Huejotzinco. These were indigenous allies that came with him and became de facto conquistadors by their own right.
The Spanish promised the Tlaxcalans all sorts of benefits by continuing on this voyage,
of exploration and subjugation. So the key strategy in Central America was alliance building and using other indigenous groups and sort of attempting to marshal the rivalries for their own benefit.
Alvarado was painfully ignorant to the scale of the conflict he was about to inflict on the world. Kickstarted a 170-year war fought with tenacious resistance by an indigenous people who refused to accept Spanish dominance.
The conquest of the Maya was complicated because the Maya were very divided. It had to be done piece by piece.
Spread across Mesoamerica for millennia, the Maya lived complex, class-based lives. They were farmers, inventors, artists, and architects, building spectacular limestone temples and crafting exquisite art out of jade. They traded with the Aztecs, yet there's little evidence to suggest they encountered or even knew of the Inca.
It was a very, very fraught conquest, very violent, very brutal, and it took many years to be accomplished.
The Maya were using bows and arrows, and they used arrowheads made of flint that disintegrated in the body after impact. They caused these horrible wounds. The Spaniards could not find water. Their armor was useless because it was too hot and humid, and they routinely lost over and over again. So we get a sense of how these military incursions, despite a great deal of energy being put into them, can really fail quite remarkably. Spaniards have a lot of trouble really succeeding on their own terms, at their own game, if you will, because of the military resources of people like the Maya. But then we see a market change. In the 1540s, Spaniards return after disease has worked its way through, this time with the far more modest goal of simply settling. They're just interested in trying to eke out an existence in this place. But even then, there's remarkable resistance. There's a huge uprising in 1546 when all of the Maya coordinate in order to kill everything Spanish that they can get their hands on. Not just people, they kill pets, they pull out Spanish plants. It's a kind of attempt to root them out, quite literally, to pull them up by the roots. That gives us a sense of just how persistent their resistance was to Spanish rule.
The final Mayan kingdom to fall under the control of the Spanish was that of the Itzumaya in northern Guatemala in 1697.
We think about conquistadors and we think about a complete victory over indigenous people. So there are enormous swaths of land and places and indigenous communities who were never fully under control of the Spaniards.
The conquest, as it were, came in phases, came in stages. The further one went into the interior, the fewer and fewer representatives of Spain or Spanish settlements we could find.
So the acts of conquistadors can be quite incomplete in many ways sometimes.
2,000 miles to the south, and just a few months after Alvarado's departure, Francisco Pizarro prepared to face the wrath of the Incas.
Francisco Pizarro's early expeditions down the Pacific coast are extremely difficult. The conditions are terrible. Many of his men die, not only from attacks from indigenous people along the coast, but from disease, and the majority of them actually simply from starvation. These are desperate expeditions that almost fail.
In 1524, Pizarro was finally ready to sail into the unknown, but his maiden voyage would soon collapse into a crushing failure. A handful of survivors marooned on an island, others
himself with his men marooned on a small island, the Isla del Gallo, and he's facing a mutiny from his companions who say, Pizarro, there's nothing down here. There's no New Mexico down here. We're all going to die. Let's go back to Panama. The story goes, Pizarro draws his sword, draws a line in the sand, and says to his men, beyond this line lies glory and riches beyond your wildest imaginations. Behind the line lies poverty and obscurity. You must make your choice. And it's said that just 13 of his companions crossed the line in the sand. They became los Trece de la Fama, the famous 13. After Pizarro's second expedition down the coast in 1526 to 27, when he finally stumbles on the northern Inca town of Tumbes, he now knows that it's true. There is another large indigenous empire or state to the south. He doesn't know anything about it this time, but he's seen enough to be intrigued. Tumbes is a significant town. He's seen gold and silver treasures there. It's clear that there's something there, there's something going on there that he wants to look into further. So it is in this juncture that he's going to go back to Spain, recruit his brothers, and also get an official permission from the king to conduct the expedition to the Andes, right? To the area where today we know as Peru. The fact that he's got a formal contract, that he's been appointed to undertake this task by the king, puts him in a much better legal position than had been the case for Cortés in Mexico. Nobody can challenge Pizarro's right to lead the conquest and to be governor of Peru from this point on.
December 27th, 1530. The determined conquistador set off on his third and final attempt to reach the south. His 3 ships loaded with heavy weaponry, 180 men and 27 horses. He had come ready for conflict, prepared to encounter a highly developed civilization willing to fight for its survival.
The Inca, similar to the Aztec Empire, rose to prominence relatively quickly. The Inca Empire, over approximately 150 to 200 years, had expanded first from this core around Cusco to adjacent valleys in the Central Highlands. South towards what's now Bolivia, eventually all the way down to west central Chile and to the north of what's now Argentina, but also north along the Andes.
Its boundaries crossed all kinds of geography and topography, almost impossible to govern, and yet they did. The ruling Inca probably numbered no more than 150,000, but they ruled over an empire of about 12 million. Tremendously wealthy, powerful.
One of the things the Incas are best known for is their road system. They developed a very extensive series of roads and highways and paths. The total distance of that road system was probably about 40,000 kilometers, and these were highly impressive pieces of engineering. They were paved with stone where necessary. They crossed ravines, they crossed bridges, they had to penetrate through sheer cliff faces, they went through tunnels. And so the Inca road system is one thing that distinguishes the Incas from other native peoples in the Americas. There's nothing really comparable in the Aztec Empire.
The actual wars of conquest that the Inca accomplished towards neighboring peoples provided the food crops, the fish, the gold and the silver that provided an economic basis for the empire. The Inca conquered other regions. Some of those regions became their close allies and benefited from this situation, don't get me wrong, but they also had polities, ethnic groups, particularly along the coast, particularly in the far north, who were foes, who weren't happy with the situation, and who were ready to revolt when the opportunity came. The Inca saw themselves as the children of the sun himself, and inheriting the power, the authority, the radiance of the sun, and made a point to dress themselves in gold and to ornament the most important buildings, sometimes covering entire walls in gold plate and gold leaf.
The empire, in times of need, provided communities with food and medicine and military assistance. It was very bureaucratic, but they also had developed these amazing methods of farming in this very rugged terrain. They had created sort of a tiered system of farming that controlled both flooding, but could also provide crop variation that fed this vast empire of 12 million people.
Following his success at the Battle of Puna, Pizarro continued his quest along the Ecuadorian coastline, his confidence bolstered by a healthy battalion of reinforcements. He and his men arrived once again to the coastal settlement of Tumbes, expecting to find the bustling port.
He finds to his astonishment that Tumbes lies in ruins. It's been sacked and destroyed, most of its population have departed. What's happened in the meantime is that there's been a civil war within the Inca Empire, a great conflict between two rival contenders for the crown.
In 1493, the very same year that Columbus first laid eyes on the Americas, the Inca Empire had peaked under the steady rule of Huayna Capac. His realm, a 2,000-mile stretch of unspoiled territory. But Europe was closing in. Capac was first made aware of the Spanish presence in the year 1515, and yet it wasn't the conquistadors who would first breach his peaceful kingdom, but their bacteria.
Sometime in the mid-1520s, before Pizarro showed up himself on the north coast of Peru, Huayna Capac got sick with an illness that nobody had seen before. This illness, we're pretty sure, was smallpox, perhaps mixed with measles as well. He died, and unfortunately for him and for his dynasty and for the empire, also gave the disease to his heir apparent, leaving the question, who's going to succeed Huayna Capac? Who's going to become the next Inca? A civil war broke out between that of Atahualpa and that of Huáscar.
Emerging victorious from that conflict is Atahualpa. He is now the new Inca emperor. And as part of his campaigning in the late stages of the Inca Civil War, he finds himself in one of the major Inca towns on the Inca Highway, Cajamarca, in the northern Peruvian highlands.
This tussle for power had thrown the Inca kingdom into disarray, whilst disease tore through the population. A perfect storm brewing, ideal for Pizarro and his army of conquistadors.
The Spaniards, when they arrived on the coast of Peru in the early 1530s, they encountered an empire in crisis.
Now this is the best news that Pizarro can possibly have received. Instead of encountering a solid empire ruled by an experienced emperor, he finds an empire riven by internal conflict and ruled by a highly inexperienced ruler who's only been Inca emperor for several months.
So it was also an empire that had been pushing its edges. The Cañari, the Chachapoyas, and the Cayambes are three examples of peoples to the north of the empire who were engaged in wars against their conquest by the Inca themselves, who then rapidly allied themselves with the Spanish during the conquest, and that's a crucial thing to understand. Different factions of the Inca and the Spaniards themselves mutually trying to manipulate the situation to gain an upper hand.
Pizarro abandoned the smoldering ruins of Tumbes, chopping his way inland through thick jungle, only stopping to establish Peru's first Spanish settlement, San Miguel de Piura. He soon grew restless,